Welcome to the Backyard Professor videos. In my exploration of trying to understand the character of early Christianity and the actual character of the New Testament, what was the New Testament? How can we best understand the New Testament Christians in all of their varieties? I've been reading James Dunn, among other people, and S.G.F. Brandon and several of the other different New Testament scholars, and I've been pondering this all day in a way that I can present the scholarly information in my own words instead of having to read them to you. Sometimes the scholars have a way of expressing things that are quite frankly, tough to understand. They make you think. That's why I like reading them. They don't just give you pap and pablum all the time. They give you some good substance to chew on, and I love that. Any attempt at trying to comprehend the actual nature of the New Testament times, the days of Jesus, are bound to cause offense with some people because we have our tidy little mental images of what reality is based on what we experience. We love to think that everybody's reality is ours. And that's simply not the case. There's a couple of ideas that I thought might help to at least get a basis of a beginning of a study on several questions like, why do the Synoptic Gospels differ so much? Now, it's true, they are very similar in many respects, of course, but that's only one side of the coin. What is causing them to be so different in so many respects? And how come the Gospel of John is so drastically different from the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And how come Paul is more different than them all? Is this all the same gospel, or is this a developed gospel? Just what did the early Christians understand about Jesus, about the concept of salvation? Did they even understand the concept of Paul's Gentile Christianity of grace, and so on and so forth? There were many different kinds of Christianities back in those days, very many different groups. There's a plural of Judaisms. Well, now we know there's a plural of Christianities as well. And the mix is hardly anything to be... The New Testament is not simple. I'll put it that way. We love to simplify things down and pretend like on the kindergarten level, Sally, Dick, and Jane aspect of the Gospels make them easier to understand and more realistic, and nothing is farther from the truth. The times of Jesus were highly complex times, with the politics, the religion, the social aspects, the economic aspects. All of it was as complicated as our day in many respects. It cheats the depth and breadth and meaning of the Scriptures to try to simplify those down into simplistic moral homiletic lessons like we all like to do. Let me give you a quick analogy. I can simplify mathematics for you, very simple. 1 plus 1 is 2. When you add something to something else, it makes it larger. So, 1 plus 2 is 3, 1 plus 3 is 4. If you subtract, you make something smaller. So, 5 minus 3 equals 2. 5 minus 5 is 0. Or you can divide. 4 divided by 2 is 2. 12 divided by 6 is 2. Or you can multiply. 3 times 3 is 9, and 9 times 1 is 9 also, while 4 times 3 is 12. There, now I've simplified mathematics for you somewhat. Do you really think, based on that simplification, you could produce calculus equations for me? Do you really think you could give me a derivative and understand how to graph 2x minus y plus 1? No, of course not. Mathematics is the essence of simplicity. It's also seriously complex. It takes years to learn mathematics. I would propose the same with the study of early Christianity and the nature of the documents in the New Testament. not to mention the Old Testament. Speaking of testaments, that launches me right off into my notes that I've taken. The only scriptures, and I believe this is one of the most critical points, and I want to spell it out for you a little more than normal. Most people have heard this. Yes, the scriptures that the early Christians had was the Old Testament. Yeah, all right, we know that, shirts. Yeah, that's nothing new. But what are the implications of this? I want you to think about this with me while I explain to you some of the ideas that came into my head. And I wrote them down because there's so many of them. I wanted to make sure I told you correctly as these ideas came to me. There was no New Testament for the people in Jesus' day to draw on. That has serious implications for the nature of early Christianity for us to begin to understand. Not intellectually, but I mean really understand what this means. For instance, they could not use something from Paul to combine with James and then tie in with the Gospel of Luke to build up an interpretation of a doctrine like we can today. Because the people that Matthew wrote for and that he was talking to may not have had anything other than the Gospel of Matthew for their entire lives. Here's why that's significant. Jesus, of course, never quoted from any of Paul's letters. Of course not. They didn't exist during his ministry. So he couldn't flip over to 1 Thessalonians and then back over here to Romans and then up into Ephesians and Galatians and then back down to 2 Corinthians. No, none of that existed. Jesus never quoted from the New Testament. It wasn't there. John may very well have not had access to Luke's book of Acts to learn from. Have you ever thought of that? We have it. But the question is, did Matthew? Did John? Is there any proof they did? Interesting, isn't it? Some congregations may have only had Matthew's gospel and not John's. All they would have known was Matthew's interpretation of things from his very Jewish viewpoint. Matthew deliberately presented a Jewish viewpoint that colors his interpretations. They could not double-check by referencing to 1 Thessalonians and then back over to Ephesians. The early Christians did not have the fullest view of the New Testament like we do today. They did not have the benefit of having the entire spectrum of all of the New Testament books in front of them to cross-check and compare and reference and see anything. They didn't have the full comprehension and view that we do today of all of the developed doctrines, of the parousia and its failed prophecies, of the reinterpreted parousia to mean a second coming of Jesus Christ. They didn't have the fully developed doctrines of Jesus, or of salvation, or of grace, or of the mission to the Gentiles instead of just to the house of Israel. They had none of this. They didn't have the apocalyptic feelings and aspects of the book of Revelation. Although Margaret Barker says they could have, she contends that the book of Revelation should be the first book in the New Testament. There's something interesting for you to chew on, huh? Maybe I'll do some videos on her presentation of the book of Revelation someday. We cannot assume that the people in Matthew's audience, or Luke's audience, or Mark's audience, or John's audience, as far as that goes, we can't assume that they had the ability to use the full wealth of an expression of information that we have. They didn't have that. All they had were fragments of knowledge. Well, this means that one congregation's understanding was different from another then, doesn't it? Of course. If Matthew had preached to one group, emphasizing as he did his own view of things, they could not double-check with the Gospel of John or Mark or Paul's letters. By selection, of what each gospel chose to emphasize, and each gospel does have its own unique emphasis. But by that very selection, that gives only a partial interpretation of the full scale of truth that we have using the entire New Testament, something they did not have access to. We can't take our full New Testament knowledge and suppose that Matthew had that. He didn't. Does that make sense? The people he wrote for didn't have the full New Testament context that we do. They only had a partial understanding based on Matthew's interpretation of the events, the words, the reasons why, etc. Same thing with Luke's audience, same thing with Mark's and John's. Well, same thing with Paul's, as far as that goes. This is why each gospel is different and why Paul's letters are more different still. There was no single one correct way to teach and preach because none of them have the full view that we do. That's why there are differences. Now, the differences, what some people would argue are contradictions, a necessary conclusion from the fact that the Gospels have contradictions is not that the Gospels are then simply made-up fairy tales and wishful stories. No, that is a conclusion you can come to, but there's other conclusions besides that. In fact, I believe there's a far more logical conclusion than that one. If a gospel contradicts another one, and they do in plenty of places, believe me, does that mean one of them has to be right and the other one is wrong? No, it does not mean that. I'm very serious, and I'll explain this. The other thing that came to mind when I was pondering this is they couldn't cross-check between the Gospels, possibly for 1 or 2 or 3 generations. The canonization process didn't begin until the late 3rd and 4th and possibly into the 5th centuries. And it's a process still going on today. There's still no agreement on the canon, let alone what the canon says or teaches or reads or means. Isn't that interesting? We're still trying to figure that one out. And the debate's starting to get very fierce right now in our day. It's picked up steam. It's a fascinating topic. But here's the thought that came to my mind. Matthew emphasizes the Jewish aspect, which certainly was far different than John's Gnostic Logos interpretation. You don't read about the Logos in Mark or Matthew or Luke, do you? No. This is why I say the audience of Mark that Mark wrote for, as opposed to the audience that John wrote for, had those two groups gotten together and discussed the gospel that they knew was true, they had a testimony of the truth. Jesus Christ is the Logos, the John audience would say. The Mark audience would say, what? Are you kidding me? No way. We were never taught that. They couldn't have been. Each one of the Gospels are a specific style of interpretation based on the circumstances, as well as the audience, as well as the time when they were written. That's why Mark's presentation is considered rough. It's not polished like Luke's, and it's certainly not full of the mature, well thought out thought of John. Every one of them have a different interpretation based on when they wrote, what time they lived in, what the audience they were presenting it to. That means each and every audience only had part of the truth of the gospel. It wasn't the whole gospel that they got taught on the shore of the Lake of Galilee when they read the Gospel of Mark. It was Mark's understanding that they were reading. Isn't that interesting? They did not have the full spectrum of the New Testament. I cannot repeat that too many times because we assume they did. We assume, well, they know what we know. Here's the whole New Testament, for Pete's sake. The whole New Testament compromises the gospel. So obviously, if the gospel was being taught in Jesus' day by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, then they had the whole gospel. And that is exactly wrong. They did not. Not by a long shot. The doctrines developed through time, and they changed. The New Testament's a beautiful proof of that. All you have to do is read it to see how those doctrines did change. It's very interesting that way. We have the benefit of John or Paul's later, more mature, advanced thinking about Jesus, the Gospels, etc. Matthew's audience didn't, and they in turn would have shared their limited view with all of their friends and family. So that the limited understanding from Matthew's Jewish viewpoint would certainly have not been the same understanding about Jesus, what he did, what he said, than Mark's Gentile audience, or John's Gnostic audience. Isn't it interesting of the four Gospels, we have it in early church history from the early church fathers, that the gospel that the Gnostics absolutely loved the most was John's. And John's is one of the most anti-ecclesiastical Gospels of all four of them. Isn't that interesting? So it's a fascinating thing. There are limited views from, say, Matthew, on Jesus' teaching of the kingdom of God and God's rule on earth. Would never have jived with John's Logos and God incarnate from before the beginning. The two are not the same information at all. It's a developed, more mature, thought-out process. But this took generations before John could finally write it down. His dating of the gospel is anywhere as late as 150, and the earliest that I've seen, I've heard that there is a fragment of John that dates to 63 A.D. That's still 2 generations after Christ, you see. And it's certainly the presentation of Matthew's Jewish gospel would certainly not have fit in with Paul's Gentile Christianity, that his letters were written to his audience. After his Gentile mission broke off with the original Jewish Christian movement of Jesus that was headed by James, Jesus' own blood brother, Paul and James were at loggerheads. I mean, all you gotta do is read the book of James and read it and see that it's a polemic directly against Paul's saved by grace. Now, of course, we today are uncomfortable with the fact that such a blatant contradiction is in the scriptures, so we try to smooth all that over. But they didn't. They didn't smooth it over at all. This is where Christianity originated from, is out of the Jewish Christian matrix of the Ebionites, who were headed by James, the Lord's brother, who was the true, actual leader of the earliest Jesus movement. And this is in the Acts. It's what Galatians is ranting and raving about. Paul in Galatians is screaming against those super apostles in Jerusalem and all. This is where the split began, was in that argument over the law, over circumcision, over the temple sacrificial cult, etc. Not the same stuff at all that Paul's audience got compared to Matthew's. Everyone's got an interpretation. This is why there are problems, so-called problems. However, there's a way out of this. Time changed the way the gospel was taught and understood. There's no single one correct way to present the gospel in an oral tradition anyway, because it's never taught the same, even though the same information can be presented. It's never taught exactly in the same words as the authentic words. It never uses the same imagery. Someone can use a different aspect and a different analogy from the plant world as opposed to the animal world, etc., to still get their same point across. But there is no single orthodox kerygma. The preaching, it was very diverse and fluid, as you can see when you read the New Testament. It's absolutely as obvious as the nose on your face. John's Logos is not Matthew's Jesus. Matthew had no idea about the Logos, nor the hundreds of thousands he might have taught Jewish Jesus to. And finally, one of my last notes, we can't take our full view. I know I'm kind of repeating myself here, but as the thoughts came down today to me, I wrote them down. We can't take our full view of the entire New Testament and say that Matthew's audience knew all this. They couldn't, because they didn't have the New Testament. That bears repeating. This is critical to understand the actual nature of early Christianity, of early Jewish Christianity. We did, but they didn't have it. And some of the audience may have never known anything else except Matthew's gospel. Just because a gospel was written doesn't mean it was spread by thousands of copies all over instantly either. I can produce this YouTube video, and in a matter of minutes, tens of thousands of people could potentially view it. That's not how it worked in the ancient world. Just because something got written down, the real question is, how many copies circulated in, say, the first decade after it was written? 10? 17, 112. How far and wide was it distributed and read? And did all the copies survive? You know, Paul talks about being in a shipwreck. Did anything in that ship survive? If he had had scriptures on that roll of vellum, did they survive with him, or were they wrecked in the shipwreck, you see? We just don't know. For the first 2 centuries, it's very plausible that very few people had all 4 Gospels together to be able to compare, cross-reference, and discuss. When we understand this as the basis for the oral society sharing different stories of Jesus, and just because Matthew presents his ideas of Jesus doesn't mean everyone in his audience is going to remember exactly the way it was read to them. If they was to repeat the story to their friends and their relatives, and then those guys present it and all that, who's to know? There is a diverse spread of different kinds of information in the earliest Jewish Christianity. That's my point. It's all because it's interpreted according to the audience and according to what the author wanted his particular audience to understand about Jesus. So I hope that helps you out to at least get a little bit of a basic background on this. I will produce more in-depth research. I've got some comparisons and cross-references I want to do with the synoptics to show you the varying interpretations, because they were based on an oral tradition which has no original. It just has a diversity of forms. Even though they're trying to share the same information does not spread evenly. People had various different types of understandings of absolutely everything they were taught in Jesus' day. And the New Testament is perfect proof of that. So thanks for watching my videos. I hope you get something out of them. Hope you're enjoying them as much as I'm enjoying making them. And I'll continue thinking and finding things interesting for you to pick up for yourselves. I'll see you in the next videos.